Hello and welcome to another episode of History Hack. I've got a fantastic guest with me today, and we're going to be talking about something complicated but incredibly interesting. So stick with us. I've got Henry Rees with me today. He's Emeritus Fellow of Jesus College, Oxford, and he was previously Chief Executive of Oxford University Press. He's the author of The Army in Cromwellian England, 1649 to 1660. Yes, you know I've taken you to the 17th century. And he's here today to tell us all about his latest book, The Fall, The Last Days of the English Republic. Hello, Henry.
Charlotte, hello, and thank you for inviting me.
Oh, no, you know that this was never going to be a chore for me to talk to you about this really neglected bit of history.
Well, it is extraordinary in terms of the way it's been passed over. And I think it's almost kind of inevitable, if you like, because it's covered at either end by monumental events. First of all, in September 1658, you have Oliver Cromwell's death and the kind of departure from the scene of this great figure. And then in May 1660, you have the restoration of the monarchy with all the scenes of Charles II riding into London, triumphant, and crowds cheering. And
Huzzah.
the bit in between just always seems this really kind of messy coda to what happened during the main business of the interregnum, and almost as a curtain raiser to the restoration. And I suppose it's not surprising it's been passed over because it is very messy, it's very complicated, a huge number of changes of regime, but it's actually incredibly important. And that's the main reason that I wrote the book.
Fantastic. It is hard, though. I mean, this is the problem with being a historian or being interested in history in any way. It's very hard not to look at this period and the fall of the English Republic, as we're calling it, over the period that you've described between the death of Cromwell to the restoration of the monarchy. It's hard not to bring the hindsight and to think, well, this was all inevitable towards this point at which the king returns. But you've set out in the book to look at this period in a very different way. Could you tell us about how you've gone about changing this discussion?
Certainly. I think the main problem is that the fact of the restoration casts a very long backward shadow over what came before it. And there is this sort of sense of there was this detour into this one slightly strange, shortish period of Republican rule in England. And then it's almost as if the normal course of English history reestablishes itself. And what I wanted to do was to provide an account of the fall of the Republic that put it in the context of the revolutionary events that had occurred since 1647, when the army first became involved in politics. And that doesn't allow the account to be distorted by the end result of what happened, i.e. the fall of the Republic. And we always see the year 1660 as one of the great turning points in English history because of the restoration of the monarchy. But actually, my argument is that it's an incredibly important turning point because it marks the end of the one experiment of non-monarchical, i.e. republican rule, that England's ever experienced. And I started out from this position of, well, here are these regimes backed by a large and formidable standing army, and why did they implode quite so conclusively? And I wanted to tease out three main themes in the book, which seemed to me to have been neglected. The first was what seemed the potential durability of a number of the regimes of this 21-month period. The first would be Richard Cromwell's Parliament, which I think had far deeper roots in the political nation than is often recognized. And then its successor regime, the restored Rump Parliament, did a remarkable job of mobilizing its supporters, what in contemporary terms were called the well-affected, against royalist risings. And the ease with which they saw off the royalist risings indicated how secure militarily the regime was. The second point I wanted to make was that really up until March 1660, so really only 2 months before the Restoration, the nation shows very little evidence of rejecting parliamentary rule in favor of monarchical rule. In other words, the Republic didn't fall because it was a republic, but because of what contemporaries called the too frequent interruptions of government. And the army, which had been this great source of stability over the last 11 years that had maintained order, had become a source of great instability in its own right. And I wanted to emphasize that the Restoration was a result of the fall of the Republic, not the cause of it. And then the third point that I wanted to make was that, again, with all those cheering crowds welcoming Charles II back, we have this image of sort of great popular enthusiasm, whereas in fact the dominant characteristic of the period of the September 1658 to really April 1660 is one of political passivity, where people just sort of sat back and slightly appalled as to what was happening, breakdown in order, and just hoped that somebody else was going to sort it out, and quite understandably didn't want to get too involved themselves. So there's a lot of the standing on the sidelines. So yeah, I think if I wanted to summarize it, I wanted to liberate our understanding of the end of Republican rule from its eclipse by the Restoration. And if we could strip away our awareness of what was going to happen, then the actions of some of the key political players become a lot more understandable. And the fear and uncertainty of contemporaries who were just sitting there observing what was happening become a great deal more understandable. And I think there's just this sense that it's seen as a predictably chaotic interim period that was almost inevitably going to follow the death of Cromwell. And I don't think it was that. I think at every turn, political actors took decisions of omission and commission that really defined what the outcome was going to be.
Amazing. And I think it's so wonderfully timely reading this book, because I think it was Ben Franklin who, when asked about America, said it would be a republic if you can keep it. And this idea that that situations and ways of government last forever, just talk to Rome, who were a republic and then a dictatorship, and come and look at what happened here if you think your republic is completely secure. We are living through incredibly fast moving political turbulence over the last few years. I think more than recent generations have seen, I think. But the events in your book, the events between just the very end of 1658 and the spring of 1660, they seem to be warp speed. Could you just pot a little bit of that history for us and just talk us through the timeline? So September 1658, 3rd of September, on his lucky day, old Jolly Ollie dies. And, as a monarchist, I'm very happy about that. What happens next?
Well, it is, as you say, it is quite extraordinary in terms of warp speed. I mean, I was thinking about it in the context of what's happened in the UK in the last 8 years. And by my calculation, we're currently on our 6th Prime Minister since 2016, which by standards of the British parliamentary system is quite ridiculous. Yeah. But if you look at the period we're talking about, in 1658 to 1660, in that 21-month period, there were, depends how you count it, but there were approximately 8 different governments. Wow. In that actual period. So picking up on your question, Oliver Cromwell dies on the 3rd of September. He's succeeded by his son, Richard Cromwell. He lasts until sort of April of 1659, when the army dissolve his parliament and then effectively restore the Rump Parliament, which Oliver Cromwell had kicked out in April 1653. So the Rump Parliament, with the backing of the army, rules from May 1659 to October 1659. At that point, the two of them have a falling out, and the army dismisses the Rump. The army then rules really by itself. It appoints what it calls a committee of safety, which has real kind of resonance in terms of the French Revolution, to rule. And that rules from sort of mid-October to sort of fourth week of December 1659. And then that rather falls apart through almost kind of weight of its own inertia. The revolt of the navy pushes it over the edge. And dissident elements in the army then restore the Rump Parliament that we last saw back in October. Now back for its third gig, so to speak. The Rump Parliament comes to power again in last week of December 1659. Then in January, General George Monk marches south from Scotland, and he and the Rump have this very uneasy coexistence that he's rather keen to keep them in power, and probably would have done if they'd handled things differently. But by about the third week of February 1660, he feels that the Rump is an obstacle to settlement, not a means to settlement, and he brings back the MPs who had been kicked out of Parliament in December 1648 by Colonel Thomas Pride, the famous Pride's Purge. So what this does is, if you like, this restores the Long Parliament, of which the Rump had been a little bit. I got to apologise for complexity here, but I did warn you. So we're now into the rule of the Long Parliament. One of the preconditions that Monk required of the Long Parliament before he restored it is it would only sit long enough to establish a timeline for new elections. It carried on until the middle of March 1660, then famously dissolved itself, having set a date for new elections. Those new elections led to a parliament, or really an assembly, which is called the Convention, which met on the 26th of April, 1660. And then in the first week of May, 1660, issued the invitation to Charles II to come back as monarch. And at the end of May, Charles returns to cheering crowds in the streets of London. So that gives you an idea of how messy and complicated it is, and why contemporaries were just in despair, as I say, at the lack of what they called settled government.
Now, I should say, for any listeners who are now feeling their heads start to explode, if you pick up a copy of The Fall, Henry explains through all of this at a very gentle pace, and you will be able to follow it. He's laughing at the moment at me saying that. We don't have the time in this episode, unless we keep you here for 3 hours, to go through all of those ins and outs. So you just have to trust me and buy the book. Henry and I are going to talk about some issues that come out of the book, and hopefully that will really wet your whistle and you'll want to read more. So it's perhaps hard, Henry, when we are contemplating all of these characters and all of these political figures at this time. The army becomes sort of this big part of everything. They are a character, they are an agent of chaos and change. And it's quite difficult, I think, with our 21st century heads on, to understand the importance of religion in the army. So how much of a motivating and driving factor was religion in military decision-making at this time?
Well, it's been said that if we were transported back to the 17th century, the two things that would hit us most are, first, how badly everybody smelled, and secondly, the extent to which religion defined every aspect of their lives. So I won't talk about the first, but on the second of those, the New Model Army's unending run of success from the time of its creation at the end of 1644, early 1645, through the last battles of the First Civil War, its victories in the Second Civil War, the conquest of Ireland, the conquest of Scotland. It reinforced a rather sort of providentialist view of the world, where much of the officer corps in particular came to see the army as God's instruments. And as one petition at the time described it, the army next under God was the only bar to the enemies of the cause. And the army was the only institution that could be trusted to provide what they called a shelter to honest people that had otherwise been hammered to dust. And the army saw itself very much as the guardian of the well-affected, the godly congregations. And perhaps the best example of how all of this fed into the army's behavior and its decision-making is to look at its relationship with the restored Rump Parliament between May to October 1659. Now, there was a strong feeling among many officers who supported the Rump's return that the army needed to atone for its apostasy in supporting the Protectorate. For many, they had expected there to be great godly reformation under Cromwell. Instead, they got what they saw as restrictions on liberty of conscience. They got all the pomp and circumstance of the Cromwellian court that looked in many respects like a monarchy. Godly opponents of the regime were imprisoned. And in its later years, the Protectorate moved very much in a conservative direction. And all of this fed into a hankering for this ill-defined idea that went under the term of the good old cause, which somehow captured this nostalgic desire for the peak days of the revolution. So in practical terms, what that meant was that when the Rump was restored, the army submitted to far harsher treatment than it had ever allowed any other body to exert on it. So there were major purges of the officer corps. The Parliament provided completely inadequate indemnity for officers' past actions, and there was a very pitiful settlement of their arrears of pay. And officers really did this as an acknowledgement of almost kind of the punishment that they deserved for their past failings. But all of this changed with the defeat of the Royalist risings in the summer of 1659. It was the first military campaigning in England for 8 years, and the army very quickly and efficiently rolled up the armed rising of Sir George Booth. And it was little more than a skirmish, but what it did was it restored their self-confidence. And what they said was, "The Lord hath once more appeared to own you, i.e. Parliament, and your army." And it gave them, I think, a sense that, okay, they'd served their time in the doghouse, and now they should be treated with respect. And it told Parliament that they were full of the sense of that seasonable mercy and success that the summer's victories had engendered. So they started getting a bit more muscular in their responses to Parliament, petitioning a bit more aggressively, and in time it led directly to the dismissal of the Rump. And success and failure were always attributed either to God's good grace or his displeasure. And when the Committee of Safety fell in December 1659, Charles Fleetwood, who was the most senior officer in the English army, bemoaned that, and it's a great quote, "the Lord had blasted them and spit in their faces." And I think it's that very kind of clear sense that God was behind every outcome that I think goes, as you say, a very long way to explaining why they were so different from us in their view of the world.
Gosh. So it's the smell, the religion, and the animal cruelty. I think I wouldn't be able to. I don't think I'd be able. I don't think they're going to have vegan options on the menu, Henry. I don't think I'm going to do very well. So I'd be a wonderful peasant. So there's one military man who really sets himself apart in terms of this religious devotion / extremism that permeates the army, and that's General George Monk. You've mentioned him before as being very important to this story, and you give him very short shrift in the book, and it's really nice to see a view of him outside of his hagiographies. Why do you think it was that George Monk chose not to save the English Republic?
Well, I think for starters, we have to understand quite how far Monk was an outsider in terms of the army. The vast majority of senior officers had served under Cromwell in the Eastern Association or in the New Model Army or in the Northern Army. Monk was a professional soldier who'd fought on the continent in the 1620s and the 1630s. He'd fought in Ireland in the 1640s. He never actually fought for Parliament in England. His only military service in England had been very briefly actually on the side of the Royalists in the First Civil War, for which he was imprisoned. He was plucked out of obscurity by Cromwell, who recognised his talents, and given senior command in Scotland. So his loyalty was to Cromwell, and personally, it was not to the army. So none of the defining way stations of the army's history, the Army Revolt of 1647, the Second Civil War, the Purge of Parliament, the execution of the king, none of these appeared in his biography. So as a result, he had a very different outlook. And it's interesting you say that I gave him short shrift. I never actually intended to sort of demean him, I suppose, in that sense. I mean, I had a lot of time for Monk. I mean, I think he was a quite brilliant military administrator. I think he was also a really tough nut. And he was pragmatic, he was hard-headed, and he had a lot of political savvy. I don't think he was a very nice man, and I think he was far kind of more unpleasant than his reputation. But the history was written by his acolytes, so I think that's perhaps rather inevitable. But what I wanted to show that his behaviour as a maker and breaker of parliaments was essentially no different from that of any of the other military men of the 1650s. And it was simply that in his case, the last parliament that he broke, if you like, led to the restoration of the monarchy. And the restoration of the monarchy is, if you like, seen in 1066 and all that terms as a good thing. Monk wasn't a monarchist or a republican, really. He was a believer in stable government and order, and would have been perfectly happy, I think, with any regime that delivered that. And his political instincts were very different, as you've said, from other members of the army. They tended to be on the sort of what they call the independent religious congregations end of the spectrum. Monk's instincts were very much closer to those of the members of parliament who were kicked out by Pride in December 1648, sort of political Presbyterianism, if you like, conservative in both politics and religion, opposed to what he called the great extent of toleration, which led to too much blasphemy and profaneness. And he was a great supporter of Richard Cromwell's regime. And there's no doubt in my mind that if Monk had been in charge of the army in London in April 1659, then Richard Cromwell's protectorate would have survived. He wouldn't have stood for all the nonsense that was going on in the army. He wasn't a natural supporter of the restored rump, but he was granted his commission by the rump. And as a professional soldier, he took it very seriously who granted his commission. That's to whom he owed his loyalty. And he supported the rump. He came out on its behalf against the army in October 1659 when he was marching south. There were a huge number of demands for a full and a free parliament, by which people essentially meant the recall of the Long Parliament, which he resisted and said that the Rump Parliament was the power in being and that people should trust it. And he really only turned against the Rump when he came to realize that it was an obstacle to settlement, that it wasn't a vehicle for settlement. And he then turns to the restored Long Parliament, and I think saw that if they were left to their own devices, that they would spend months, if not years, negotiating with the exiled royalist court. And the nation couldn't stand that degree of uncertainty and delay, especially that the army was in a very, very febrile state. So Monk is pushing all the time for a government that will provide order and provide it quickly. And really, almost anyone would have done that could have proved to him that it could. And in the end, I think he realized that the return of the monarchy was the one means to that restoration of settlement.
I mean, we're seeing it, we're living through it in the last few years, aren't we? You realise just how important stable, comfy government is. And it almost makes you look at this time a bit more kindly and realise that, of course, people just didn't want to be upheaved again and again and again and have different parliaments coming in and different sort of ways of ruling every 5 minutes. You can really see that actually people just kind of wanted something stable, something, and that sort of, we talk about him being conservative with the small c. He just wanted everything to be stable and steady and ordered. And that feels like the motivation.
Very, very much so. And I think it's a very reasonable human expectation to assume that the government of your country will just provide security and order at a very basic level. Then what they do beyond that is dependent on the flavour of the government.
Everything other than that is a bonus. I'll take stable every day. So it's very interesting. Our view of Richard Cromwell throughout time has very much been coloured by Lucy Hutchinson and her assessment of him as being meek, temperate, quiet, a man who sort of finds this job he's given just too much for him. I think this is absolutely wonderful that for once our view of a historical figure has been coloured by what a woman wrote about him. That's wonderful for me. But what's your assessment of the man? Was he just not up to the job? Was the Protectorate itself so tied to the cult of personality that was Oliver Cromwell that it couldn't survive him?
Well, I think Richard Cromwell's reputation was badly in need of rehabilitation, and it's certainly gone through that process probably in the last 20 years, away from the image of tumble-down Dick. We now have a much more balanced view of him. He possessed attributes that many monarchs who came both before and after him really lacked. I mean, he was diligent and dedicated he worked hard, implemented the duties of office. He had a very devout Puritan personality, and many of his contemporaries saw him as embodying the virtues of the godly magistrate. He knew how to behave in public, which, again, a lot of monarchs haven't done. He could deliver a speech well, and he had an easy personal manner. Even those who were opposed to his rule actually rather liked him and sort of said, well, we don't like the Protectorate, but it's nothing personal. And I think he would have proved to be actually an admirable ruler for a nation with a stable political culture and an established regime. And Lucy Hutchinson, who you just quoted, went on to say that he lacked the spirit to manage, and this is the quote, such a perplexed government. And I think that's perhaps at the heart of it. He really lacked the stomach and the aptitude and the instinct that his father had for political infighting and that sort of instinctive decision-making, where Cromwell would just march from Whitehall down to Westminster and dissolve Parliament without really telling anybody else. But I think it's very important that we get away from these rather deterministic assumptions, which I think they're in the second part of your question about Oliver Cromwell and the cult of personality, and this idea that everything was going to change for the worse after Cromwell's death. And inevitably, I think Oliver Cromwell's persona looms so large that the idea has taken hold that only his strength of character held together the centrifugal tendencies of the revolutionary movement. Richard, in many ways, was a far more attractive proposition to large numbers of the political nation than his father was. Now, you think Oliver Cromwell had this kind of bloodthirsty past. He was the key driver of the regicide. He was the man who had broken parliaments. He was the man who had introduced the military sort of domination of politics. Richard was a different generation. He was viewed as a clean slate. He was in many respects more conservative than his father, which made him very appealing to a great many people. Many politicians who had abhorred the purge of Parliament in 1648 and the execution of the king in January 1649 found that they could come back into public life under Richard in ways that they'd found difficult to do under Oliver. And in Richard's Parliament, which ran from January to April 1659, you can see conservative politicians making strenuous efforts to turn the humble petition and advice, this constitution that had offered the crown to Oliver in 1657, but it was a mess as a constitution, to reshape it into a way that would become a working constitution. And one can well imagine that if Richard Cromwell had survived, let's say, 5 years, that there would have been another offer of the crown to him, which he might well have accepted. And it's intriguing. Richard Cromwell lived into his mid-80s, and he only died in 1712, 2 years before the Hanoverian succession. He could have been one of the longest living monarchs in British history.
It's amazing. I always think it speaks a lot about both the person of Richard Cromwell and the person of Charles II, that Richard just off he went into sort of a self-imposed exile and was left alone, was not sort of dragged to sort of stand a mock trial or anything, or put in the Tower of London. He was just left, nothing at all.
Yeah, which I think is perhaps an indication of what little threat he was seen to represent to the restored monarchy. But yes, lives this incredibly sad life. Flees England in 1660, never sees his wife again, lives on the continent for 20 years, and sort of comes back in the 1680s, I think, and lives very quietly.
Was she unable to travel with him?
Well, I think so. She was there. Well, I don't know. She was left looking after the kids. So I don't know whose choice that was.
Sorry, Richard, we can't move. You just have to go off on your own. I do feel for him, but I think they could have followed him if they wanted to. Come on.
You do think.
Bless him. Tumble down Dick. No, we're giving him another view. So look, we talk about the army grandees, which I love that word, the army grandees, and we talk about Monk's march south all the time. If you're into this period, we talk about it all the time, don't we, Henry? But we perhaps ignore the part that the Navy played in this. So how critical is the revolt of the Navy to the fall of the Committee of Safety that's kind of going on in 1659?
Well, I think what you've got to recognise is that the accounts that were written of what actually happened in this period were by and large written by Monk's loyalists. So they inevitably played up the importance of Monk's march south from Scotland. But if you actually look at what was happening, it's really by early December 1659, Monk was isolated. He'd taken control of Scotland, but he was hedged in. There was an English army in the north of England that meant he could not march south. He'd put out feelers to the army in Ireland, to the City of London, to the gathered congregations, to the Navy, and they'd all come back and said, no, we don't want anything to do with you. You're just kind of, you're causing grief. You're exposing us to the royalists. You're on your own. And if things had continued, one could well imagine that Monk could just have remained isolated and eventually would have had to have sued for peace with the army in England. And two things happened in the south of England in December 1659. A group of renegade members of the Rump Parliament seized the garrison of Portsmouth, and almost at the same time, the Navy under a Republican Vice Admiral called John Lawson revolted. And the two things were really what brought down the army. The revolt of the Navy in particular, Lawson sailed his ships up the Thames, and it meant that he essentially could block all of London's trade. And so there was a sort of practical arm to his move, but also there was a sort of psychological blow to the army that it represented, because Lawson was a hardline Republican. And I think it sort of hit them hard that, and Clarendon in his history pointed this out some years later, that he was more Republican than they were. And if he was opposing them, what did this mean? And I think the combination of the fall of Portsmouth, and when the troops besieging Portsmouth went over to the people inside the garrison, and that combined with the revolt of the Navy, were what pushed the Committee of Safety to just kind of literally collapse and fall in upon itself. The revolt of the Navy was the sort of defining shove that brought the Committee of Safety down. And by the time Monk marches south in January the 1st, 1660, the Rump Parliament has been restored. I mean, Monk imagined that he was going to be the great saviour of parliamentary government and march south. By the time he sets out, the Rump has been back in power for the best part of a week. And it all looks a bit sort of over the top. Do we really need you down here? That kind of thing. So, yes, I mean, it always comes down to history gets written by the victors.
That's it. It's always really hard to imagine just how long everything takes to happen at this time. We're so used to instant information, like straight away. Oh, Cromwell's dead. It's come up on Twitter. Everything being so instant and being able to move across the country at a pace. The idea that information takes a while to reach Scotland, takes a while to reach Ireland, and by the time you've put commissioners in place and you've mustered your men and you've got your Scottish regiments safely in Scotland because you don't want to invade with the Scottish army, bad optics. You've got everyone together and you're moving. By the time you reach London, completely different situation. What's going on with the Navy? What's happening here?
Absolutely. I mean, there were a huge number of developments in Ireland, which, if communication had been faster, would probably have had a massive impact on what was happening in London. But given it took about 2 weeks for news to get to Ireland and get back, by the time news reached London, events had already overtaken it. And news took about 3 days on a fast horse to get to Edinburgh. So not as bad as Ireland. But again, they were always playing catch-up with the course of events.
Yeah, and of course that explains the fact that in Ireland you've got Henry Cromwell, Richard's brother, with an army,
sure,
who maybe could have helped in some way or provided some support, but the fact that you've got that 2 weeks to even tell him what's going on, it's just too quick at this time. You couldn't do anything.
That's absolutely right. And by the time he knew what had happened in London, the Rump Parliament had been restored. So there was nothing that he could do. So, it's something that, as you quite rightly say, that we very easily forget, the time that everything took.
Gosh. Now, I'm going to take us away from high politics and everything for a minute, because obviously we've covered so much in this episode, and I would say to listeners that there are some wonderful characters that come up in Henry's book, and you must go through and meet them and meet some of their real concerns during this time. Is there anyone in particular in the book who you just loved exploring, Henry?
Well, there's a very interesting Essex clergyman called Ralph Jocelyn, who was a distant observer of events, but he's actually a reasonably well-informed one. And he was a supporter of Parliament all through the First Civil War and the Second Civil War, but he was very much kind of moderate. He was worried about the Quakers, and his diary is, the two things that concerned him most were his family and his farm and his congregation, or three things. But he's aware of what happens. And it's just interesting as to just the worries that sort of take over him from April 1659. He disapproved of the dissolution of Richard Cromwell's Parliament by what he called this self-seeking, deceitful crew. And with the fall of the Protectorate, he described this very shattered face of things in the nation. When the rump was restored, he wasn't terribly happy. He said, well, sectaries, i.e. the members of the congregations, religious radicals, said, men gaze on this, sectaries rejoice. And it was that sense of men gazing, I think, that you get all through this period of what's going to happen. Do we want to be part of this? This doesn't look as if it's heading in a great direction. With the fall of the rump in October 1659, he said, our sins threaten our ruin. And again, the sense of what we were talking about earlier, that this is sort of divine judgment on what England has become. And under the army rule of the Committee of Safety, he describes it as, well, a quiet time in the nation, but men's minds exceeding discontent. Again, this sense, people are not doing anything, but they're very unhappy with the way things are going. And then in January, where he can see nothing but confusions in the world. And then he puts in his diary a statement which I think just captures perfectly the attitude as to what actually happened in the early months of 1660. He said, the nation looking more to Charles Stuart out of love to themselves, not him. And I think that just encapsulates kind of why people turned back to the monarchy. Not because they had any great love for the Stuarts, who were seen as a source of confusion and disorder in many respects, but they had just reached the stage where they'd rolled through every other possible alternative in government, and this was the only one left standing. And I think that's it. Out of love to themselves, not him, just captures it perfectly. And in this diary of this clergyman, in the midst of all his talk about his illnesses of his family, his wife being pregnant, what was happening with his congregation, how many people turned up to his services, what his plantings were looking like on his farm, just these comments of just the sense that the world outside him is falling apart. Yeah. I think it's very powerful.
Amazing. It's really lovely in the book to meet some real people at this time when you do spend so much time with the, like I say, with the high politics and the big players. It's nice to actually meet some of the ordinary folk who actually had to live through this. So as we start to wrap up our conversation, I could talk to you, like I said, all day about this. Do you think there's one moment that you would hold responsible, that you could say to someone if they said, what was the one reason the English Republic fell? What would you say to them?
Well, I pinpoint a date, which is actually one that really doesn't appear that much in the history books. And that would be the 12th of October, 1659. And that day, the Rump Parliament annulled the commissions of 9 senior army officers, including Major General John Lambert, the second most senior officer in the army. And that evening, MPs ordered 3 regiments to come to Westminster to defend them against the army. The army senior officers were never going to tolerate such an attempt to divide the army as they saw it. They called out the other regiments in London. There was a standoff. And overnight and the following day, the regiments who'd been called out to defend Parliament marched back to quarters, and the army dismissed Parliament. And it was one of those cases where Parliament badly misinterpreted what the army was up to. They thought the army were limbering up for another coup. The army was, in fact, they were flexing their political muscle, but the last thing they wanted was to get rid of Parliament. And one of the members of the Rump was in the Baltic on a diplomatic mission. And he wrote in a letter, "I cannot imagine what could put them, my fellow MPs, upon so contrary a course, destructive unto themselves and dangerous to our long defended cause." And I think it's a point where you can make a respectable case that it's this rupture between the army and the Rump marks the point where the fall of the English Republic becomes possible to conceive of. It doesn't become inevitable, but it's really the first point where you can say that is a distinct possibility of an outcome in a way that earlier you couldn't. So that would be, I say, my sort of date. It's the unknown date. Unlike 20th of April 1653 when Cromwell dissolves the Rump, or January 30th 1649 when Charles is executed. Not a date that gets much coverage, but I think it's pretty significant.
12th of October 1659. We will mark it in our calendars. Henry, thank you so much for coming to talk to me today. Listeners, the full Last Days of the English Republic by Henry Rees is available now wherever you get your books. It's a wonderful, wonderful read. And I promise Henry is your guide through this incredibly confusing time. And he makes it very, very easy to understand. Henry, thank you so much. It's been lovely to talk to you.
Thanks very much, Charlotte. I enjoyed it.